Memphis, 1968. To the casual observer, the city moved with a rhythmic, predictable precision. The sun rose over the river, the traffic flowed, and the streets were cleared before the first business doors unlocked. It was a machine that seemed to run on its own. But the reality of that efficiency relied on a silent, constant force. Before the city stirred, they were already moving. They navigated the alleys and the service routes, clearing the waste of 1,000,000 lives while the rest of the population slept.
They were the backbone of the urban landscape, yet they were treated as features of the architecture rather than human beings. They were everywhere in the city, but their faces were never remembered.
They moved through the periphery of public life, essential to the survival of the municipality,
yet relegated to the deepest shadows of its society. They were the sanitation workers. They were the ones who ensured the city remained clean, even as they were systematically scrubbed from the city's conscience.
It was a quiet, grinding injustice, a baseline of neglect that everyone accepted as the natural order of things.
But in the humid air of that winter, the silence began to reach its breaking point.
The work began long before the heat peaked. By mid-morning, the air in the alleys was thick and stagnant. Men gripped heavy metal cans, the rims rusted and jagged, biting into calloused palms. There were no gloves. There was only the raw friction of metal against skin. They hoisted the containers, the contents leaking a dark, foul-smelling slurry that stained their skin and soaked through to their pores. The strain was constant. It settled in the lower back, a dull, throbbing ache that never truly left. When the midday sun hit the asphalt, the temperature rose until the air shimmered, making every movement a battle against exhaustion. They hauled, they lifted, and they dumped, repeating the motion hundreds of times a day. If a can slipped, or a lid gashed a leg, there was no pause. A man simply wiped the blood on his leg and kept moving. Rain offered no respite. When the clouds opened, they were barred from stepping inside city buildings to wait out the storm.
They were left to stand in the downpour, shivering, until the trucks were ready to move again.
Their bodies were treated as disposable tools, used until they broke, then cast aside like the refuse they cleared from the streets. Every minute was a test of endurance, a silent, grinding sacrifice of flesh and bone. The exhaustion was not just in their muscles, it was in the office of the mayor. Henry Loeb held the city in a tight, unyielding grip. The workers tried to organize, to speak, to demand a seat at the table.
They sought the basic protection of a union. The answer from the administration was always the same: silence, followed by a hard refusal. Loeb viewed their demands as an affront to his authority. He tightened the budget, squeezed the payroll, and ensured that every request for fair wages died on his desk. The poverty was not an accident. It was a policy. They were trapped. Every time they reached for a better future,
the city government pushed them back into the dirt. The oppression felt heavy, a thick, invisible wall that circled the city. It was in the way the supervisors looked through them.
It was in the way the city council redirected funds while the workers struggled to keep their families fed. There was no path upward.
The system was designed to keep them exactly where they were, broken, silent, and desperate. Every day, the pressure mounted. The air in the city grew stagnant with the weight of this injustice. They were being squeezed, and the city government watched, refusing to offer a hand, waiting for the inevitable crack. The sky turned a bruising purple, and the deluge hit Memphis with sudden, violent force. Sheets of rain hammered the pavement, turning the streets into slick, gray rivers.
Eckel Cole wiped the stinging water from his eyes and looked toward the nearby city building. The doors were locked, as they always were. No worker was permitted inside, regardless of the weather. He gestured to Robert Walker, who was hunched against the wind, his skin pale and shivering. They were saturated to the bone, their movements slowing under the relentless chill.
Seeking any reprieve from the freezing downpour, They scanned the alleyway. There was nowhere else to go. Their truck sat idling in the rain, a hulking mass of steel. It was the only shelter they had. They moved toward the rear, the mud sucking at their boots with every step. Eckel reached the back of the vehicle,
finding the gap near the mechanical compactor. It was dark, tight, and smelled of rotting waste.
but it was dry. They climbed inside, huddling together in the cramped, metallic cavity. It was a desperate, final attempt to escape the bite of the storm. They sat in the narrow space, listening to the rain lash against the metal roof, unaware that they had stepped into a trap set by years of institutional indifference.
Inside the steel cavity, the rain sounded like a distant roar against the heavy metal plates. Eckel Cole shifted his weight, trying to find a position that did not ache. Robert Walker leaned against the inner wall,
his breath hitching in the damp air. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of water from the loading hatch.
Then, a sharp, metallic groan vibrated through the floor. It was not the wind. It was the sound of rusted gears grinding into motion. The hydraulic lines hissed, a high-pitched scream of pressure building in the confined space. Before either man could move, the heavy steel ram began to slide forward. There was no time to shout, no time to scramble for the exit. The machine, plagued by years of neglect and faulty wiring, surged with lethal force. It crushed the space between the walls, closing the gap with sickening finality.
The mechanical roar drowned out everything. In a heartbeat, the silence of the alleyway returned, heavier than before.
The rain continued to fall, washing over the silent, idling truck. 2 lives were extinguished in the shadows, leaving behind only the cold, unyielding metal that had become their tomb. The city kept moving,
oblivious to the fact that the foundation of a revolution had just been laid in the wreckage of a broken machine.
The news did not arrive through official channels. It traveled by word of mouth, whispered in the back of trucks and in the dim light of the break rooms. 2 men were dead, crushed by the very equipment that failed them daily.
The city offered no apology and no change. When the sun rose 2 days later, the silence in the sanitation yard was different.
It was heavy with realization. One worker stepped forward, set his heavy trash bin down on the pavement with a loud, final thud, and turned away from the truck. Another followed, then another.
The hesitation that had kept them bound to their low wages for years evaporated.
They saw the fate of their brothers and recognized their own future in that broken machine. One by one, the trucks remained parked. The engines stayed cold. 1,300 workers walked out of the gates, leaving the streets behind. They moved not as individuals, but as a single, unstoppable force. They abandoned the refuse of the city to confront the rot within the government.
Their tools lay abandoned on the concrete, discarded markers of a life they refused to lead any longer.
The walkout was not a request for negotiation. It was a total withdrawal of their labor. The city had ignored them for decades, but as the men marched away from the depot, they ensured they could no longer be ignored.
The streets of Memphis became a stage for a new kind of defiance. The workers gathered in tight ranks, shoulders brushing against shoulders, filling the pavement from curb to curb. In their hands, they held white placards, hand-painted with bold, black lettering. The words were simple, yet they cut through the noise of the city. I am a man. It was not a demand for better hours or higher pay. It was a refusal to be treated as a disposable tool. As the column moved forward, the signs bobbed like a sea of white caps above the crowd. Police stood in rows, arms crossed, watching the marchers with hardened eyes. The men did not break their stride. They held the signs high, thrusting them toward the windows of City Hall and the faces of those who had denied their humanity. Every step was deliberate, a rhythmic beat against the asphalt. The signs became a shield, a collective statement that forced onlookers to confront the reality standing before them. The air grew thick with the sound of thousands of feet hitting the ground in perfect synchronization. The message was inescapable. It was a visual declaration that shattered the status quo, turning the streets into a corridor of dignity. For the first time, the city could not look away from the people it had spent years trying to ignore. The news of the Memphis Strike did not stay contained within the city. It traveled along the wires, carried by newspaper headlines and radio broadcasts that reached across the country. Telephone lines at labor offices hummed with inquiry. Telegrams arrived by the dozens, expressing solidarity from distant states. The strike was no longer just a local dispute. It was becoming a symbol of a broader struggle for economic justice. In Atlanta, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. received the reports. He read the accounts of the men marching with their signs and saw the connection to the larger fight for civil rights. The tension in Memphis had reached a breaking point,
and the arrival of national attention shifted the balance of power. The city government tightened its grip,
but the pressure from the outside world began to weigh heavily. Dr. King made his decision. He would travel to Memphis to stand with the workers. The announcement rippled through the movement, turning a desperate strike into a historic confrontation. Anticipation settled over the city like a storm cloud. The workers knew that the presence of such a figure would bring the eyes of the entire nation upon them. The stakes had been raised, and the path ahead promised both immense risk and the possibility of fundamental change. The room was packed so tightly that the air turned heavy with warmth and breath. Men who had spent their days hauling refuse now stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to the podium. He did not rush. He looked out at the faces marked by fatigue and saw the weight of the city resting upon them. When he spoke, his voice cut through the restless murmurs, commanding total silence. He spoke of the work they did, not as a menial task, but as a pillar of civilization.
"Whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity, it has dignity," he declared.
The words landed with the force of a physical weight. The men shifted, their eyes locking onto his, the exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He bridged the gap between their labor and the fight for civil rights, weaving their struggle into a larger tapestry of justice. The atmosphere in the hall grew electric. Every worker felt the sudden, sharp realization that their fight was not for crumbs, but for their status as human beings. The tension that had been frayed by fear was now pulled taut by a shared sense of moral purpose. They were no longer just strikers. They were the vanguard of a movement that demanded to be recognized. The march started with rhythm. Thousands of feet moved in unison across the asphalt, chanting in a steady, rolling wave. The air felt clear. Then, without warning, the sound of shattering glass tore through the line.
A storefront window exploded inward, spraying shards across the sidewalk. The orderly column fractured instantly. People stumbled, shouting as they collided with one another, trying to find footing in the sudden surge. From the cross streets, the police arrived in force. They did not shout warnings. They moved with clubs raised, driving into the mass of people. The rhythmic chanting died, replaced by the sharp, wet thud of wood hitting flesh and the frantic cries of those caught in the crush. A man near the front went down, disappearing under a wave of bodies scrambling to flee. Tear gas canisters hissed, releasing thick gray plumes that turned the street into a blinding maze. Visibility vanished. The peaceful line disintegrated into a frantic, disjointed mess of bodies pushing against the concrete. Men clawed at the air, coughing, eyes streaming, as the sound of sirens began to drown out every other noise. The promise of the morning had been eclipsed by the raw, unpredictable chaos of the street. The hotel room was silent, a sharp contrast to the roar of the streets below. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
sat at a small desk, the light from a single lamp casting long, jagged shadows against the wall.
He rubbed his eyes, the skin beneath them tight with exhaustion.
His hands rested on a stack of reports detailing the arrests and the injuries from the march. Every line of text measured the human cost of the struggle. He reached for a glass of water, but his fingers paused mid-air as he noticed a fresh envelope pushed under the door.
He opened it slowly. It was not a message of support. The ink was jagged, the words a blunt promise of violence directed at him. He set the paper down, his breath slowing as he stared at the wall. The weight of the movement was no longer a theoretical burden. It was a physical pressure in the room, making it difficult to stand.
He walked to the window and looked out at the dark horizon of Memphis. He knew the path forward was narrowing. Every step he took now pulled the tension tighter, toward a conclusion he could no longer avoid.
The threats were no longer whispers in the dark. They were the inevitable cost of the ground he had chosen to stand on.
Thunder rolled over Memphis, shaking the foundations of the Mason Temple. Outside, rain fell in heavy, relentless sheets, turning the streets into slick ribbons of black water. Inside, the hall was packed shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick, humid, and vibrating with the collective breath of thousands. Rain hammered against the metal roof with a deafening, rhythmic roar that drowned out all conversation. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered, dimmed to a dull amber glow, and then hummed back to full intensity. The crowd shifted, a ripple of movement passing through the pews as people gripped the backs of the seats. Feet shuffled against the floorboards, creating a dry, scraping sound that cut through the thunder. There were no songs tonight, no rhythmic clapping, just the sound of the storm and the heavy, sharp intake of breath as the minutes ticked by. Every person in the room leaned forward, eyes fixed on the empty stage. The tension was a physical cord pulled taut, vibrating with the weight of what was coming. They sat in the dim light, waiting for the one voice that could cut through the dark. The storm raged on, but inside, the hall held its breath in total, anticipatory silence. Dr. King stepped to the podium. He did not lean on the lectern. He stood square, his hands gripping the sides as if anchoring himself to the floor. The storm outside hit a sudden,
unnatural lull, and the silence in the hall became absolute. He began to speak,
his voice low but reaching the back rows with precise, rhythmic force. He spoke of the mountain he had climbed, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the back wall of the temple. His sentences were measured, each word hitting the air with the weight of a stone dropped into a deep well. He described a future he might not reach, a landscape of justice that he could see but not touch. He shifted his weight, his eyes scanning the faces in the front row, not searching for approval, but for recognition. The air in the room grew cold. He paused, his breath visible for a second in the humid heat. When he reached the final cadence, he did not raise his voice.
He let the words hang in the still air, heavy with a finality that felt like a closing door.
The crowd sat frozen, the prophetic warning settling over them like a shroud. The morning air in Memphis was crisp, clearing the humidity of the previous night. The Lorraine Motel stood quiet, the morning sun casting long, sharp shadows across the parking lot. A few cars were parked near the stairs. The sound of a distant city bus rumbled intermittently, breaking the stillness. Dr. King stepped out of room 306, his movements slow, deliberate. He walked to the edge of the second-floor balcony. He leaned his hands on the metal railing, looking down at the pavement below. The metal felt cold beneath his palms. He adjusted his position, shifting his feet on the concrete, and looked out across the street toward the neighborhood. A few people moved on the sidewalk, their figures small and indistinct from his vantage point. He remained there, motionless, watching the life of the city stir. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of a nearby tree. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs. There was no noise of protest, no shouting, only the steady rhythm of the city waking up. He stood in the open, exposed to the light.
As the seconds ticked by in a silence that felt heavy and absolute, the world held its breath. The silence shattered. A single sharp crack echoed off the brick walls of the motel. Far louder than the city traffic, Dr. King did not have time to turn. The force of the impact spun him, his grip on the railing slipping as his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the concrete balcony, his body hitting the floor with a heavy, final thud. For a heartbeat, the world stopped moving. Then, the shouting began. Voices rose from the parking lot, jagged and desperate, calling out in disbelief. Feet hammered against the stairs as people surged toward the balcony, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. The air, once still, filled with the sound of sirens cutting through the distance, growing louder by the second. On the ground below, the light shifted as more people crowded into the space, their eyes fixed upward. A man reached the second floor, his hands trembling as he knelt beside the fallen leader, pointing frantically toward the brush across the street. The movement had its heart, and in one fraction of a second, that heart was silenced. The concrete was stained, and the weight of what had just occurred began to ripple outward, turning the morning into a scene of absolute, irreversible shock. The news moved faster than the radio waves. Within minutes, the streets of Memphis transformed. The shock that held the crowd at the motel turned into a jagged, raw fury. A brick shattered a storefront window on Main Street, the sound of glass hitting pavement, lost in the rising roar of the mob. Smoke began to curl into the sky, rising from trash cans overturned in the middle of intersections. People poured out of their homes, filling the sidewalks, their faces set in hard lines of disbelief. The protest for labor rights was suddenly eclipsed by a wider, more violent eruption of long-suppressed pain. Across the nation, the story hit the wire. In cities hundreds of miles away, lights flickered in windows as people gathered around television sets, watching the reports of flames licking at the night sky. In the industrial zones,
The machines stopped. Workers walked away from their stations, leaving tools where they lay.
the infrastructure of the city groaned under the weight of the collective outburst. Barricades went up. The air grew thick with the smell of scorched rubber and ash. Every corner held a new group, voices rising in unison, demanding answers where there were only ruins. The movement was teetering on the edge of total collapse.
The fires burned, but in the meeting halls, the atmosphere shifted from panic to a cold, hard focus.
The sanitation workers gathered, their faces etched with soot and exhaustion. They looked at the empty chairs where their leaders had stood,
Then looked at each other. A man stood up, his hands calloused and stained, and set his picket sign against the wall. It was not discarded. It was cleaned. One by one, others followed suit. They did not head to the barricades to throw stones. They headed to the assembly points. The choice was made in the silence of the room. They would not let the violence define their end. The next morning, they formed a line. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the damp air, blocking the entrance to the city administrative building. No shouting, no wreckage, just a wall of men refusing to move. They held their signs high, the painted letters sharp against the gray sky.
They stood in the rain for hours, ignoring the cold, ignoring the tension of the police watching from the perimeter.
They had lost their voice, but they had found a new, unshakable rhythm. They were no longer just strikers. They were a collective force that had survived the impossible. The city officials looked out from behind locked glass, watching the line grow longer as more workers joined the formation, their presence a silent, immovable weight. The pressure outside the administrative building became impossible to ignore. By the second day, the silence of the line had worn down the resolve of the city council. A heavy oak door swung open, and the mayor's representatives stepped onto the stairs, their faces drawn and pale. They did not speak at first. They simply motioned for the strike leaders to enter.
Inside, the room smelled of stale coffee and floor wax.
There were no cheers when the documents were laid out on the table. The workers walked in, their boots leaving muddy prints on the polished floor. They stood around the table, watching the ink dry on the union contract. It was a formal acknowledgement of their status, a guarantee of fair wages, and a mandate for safety gear that should have been provided years earlier. A union representative picked up the pen, his hand steady, and signed the ledger. The strike was over. The workers stepped back out into the daylight, but the city felt different. The air was no longer heavy with the threat of collapse. It was charged with the quiet weight of a hard-won reality. They had forced the hand of the government, not through the fire of the riots, but through the singular, persistent act of refusing to be invisible.
They walked away from the site, each man aware that the cost of this paper had been paid in blood.
Years passed, and the sharp edges of the conflict began to soften under the weight of time. The Lorraine Motel, once a backdrop for a national tragedy, underwent a profound transformation. The neon sign that flickered through the night of the assassination was preserved, but the rooms were emptied of their ghosts and filled with the artifacts of a movement. Where tape and sirens once marked the perimeter, exhibits now stand as silent witnesses to the events of 1968. The balcony, once a place of sudden, violent silencing, became a threshold for public reflection. Visitors walk the same walkway, looking out over the city that once refused to see the men who kept its streets clean.
The air inside the museum carries a different temperature. It is heavy with the quiet of people reading,
observing, and processing the cost of their own history. The transition was not instantaneous. It required the deliberate labor of those who insisted that this site could not be allowed to crumble into obscurity. Today, the museum serves as a physical anchor in the landscape, grounding the memory of the sanitation workers and the leader who gave his life for their cause. It is a space where the echoes of the past are caught in the glass and steel, demanding that every person who enters acknowledges the foundation upon which their own present is built. The legacy of those brave men in Memphis reaches far beyond the boundaries of a labor dispute. It stands as a testament to the unyielding human spirit that persists when the world demands silence. When we look back at the marchers and the leader who stood with them, we see the raw power of collective action. We see what happens when the invisible choose to be seen. But history does not stop at the museum door. It travels with us, manifesting in the small choices we make every day. The workers asked for dignity, and in doing so, they forced a city to acknowledge the humanity of every person who walked its streets.
Their struggle leaves us with a haunting, persistent question that echoes through the halls of our own time. It is a question that requires no answer in the moment,
but demands a life lived in response. What are we willing to stand for when the world expects us to remain quiet? The ground they broke is still open. The choices they made are still ours to inherit. As the sun sets over the city, the silence that remains is not an absence of sound, but an opportunity for action. The question hangs in the air, waiting for us to choose our own path forward.